Just while we're waiting, I'll just do a little introduction. So you can see the housekeeping rules on your screen. Welcome to our library webinar today, Peer Review and Critical Thinking, where we have a panel of lecturers. So Jenny from the library is going to ask our panel questions on some issues that we're often asked by students about their assignment. So Jenny, would you like to give us a wave? Hello. Okay, and so our panel of lecturers, we have Dr. Anna Rose from Occupational Therapy. Hello, Anna. We have Dr. Annika Herb and Dr. Erin McCarthy from Digital Humanities.
Hi.
Good morning. And we're just waiting on Dr. Bonnie McBain from the School of Life and Environmental Sciences. So we're hoping that she's able to join us soon. All right, so Jenny, are you happy to get started?
I guess so. Probably conscious of the time more than anything.
Yeah.
So hello everybody, and thank you to our academics that have given up so much time today to be with us. So thank you for that. There will be a few questions that we'll be asking that the academics will be able to answer for us. So the first question is for Erin. Students often come to the library saying that they have been told they can't use Google and have to use peer-reviewed sources in their assignments. Can you explain what peer review is and the process and how the process works?
Sure, that's a great question. So peer review is a kind of quality control that academics do for other academics' work. When I've spoken to some of my colleagues about peer review, we all acknowledge that there are potential problems in the system, but overall it tends to make your work better. So just to give you a sense of how it works, I'll give you a brief overview of the process. So it typically starts when you have your great idea, and you spend weeks or months or sometimes years sort of thinking about it and researching it and writing it up. And then when you finally have things, an article or a book in a state where you're pretty happy with it, you send it off to a journal or a publisher. And then, at least in the humanities, you wait. Sometimes journals are very quick, but it's not uncommon to wait for months or even years. I published my first book this year. I had been working on some form of it for more than a decade, and I had contacted the publisher in January 2017. And it was a pretty smooth process, and it still took until February 2020 for that book to be in my hands. So what are you waiting for in the meantime? Well, behind the scenes, the editor who receives your submission first kind of looks through it themselves to decide if it's a good fit for the venue and whether they think it's worth publishing. So if I were to send an article about 17th century literature off to Nature, the editor would go, no, this is not for us. Like, this might be okay, but it's not a good fit for Nature, and they would reject it. And this is called a desk rejection. It's okay. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with that article. It just means Nature isn't the correct home for my literature article. And so send it to another journal, fine. But if the editor likes what you've sent them, or if they at least see some potential in it, they'll send it out to peer reviewers. These are experts on the subject that you've written about, who provide feedback, usually in my field anonymously, but sometimes not. If it's anonymous on both sides, that is, the author doesn't know who the reviewers are and vice versa, that's called double blind, and that's common in journals. But sometimes the reviewers will know who the author is, or they'll be able to figure it out. And so then it's not double blind, but the author usually doesn't know who the reviewers are unless they identify themselves. In the humanities, editors typically start with 2 reviewers. This can vary depending on disciplines, and these reviewers will read the work, make suggestions for improvement. Even if they love it, they're going to give you suggestions and changes, and if they really dislike it, they're going to give you even more suggestions. And they'll make recommendations that the work be published either as it is, which is quite rare, with minor or major revisions, which I think is usually what you hope for when you send something out, or that the piece not be published at all. And again, that doesn't mean that it won't be published anywhere. It's just not going to be published there. Sometimes if they've sent it to 2 reviewers and they don't agree, the editor will then contact a 3rd reviewer, kind of to break the tie. And so when the editor communicates the decision to you, they'll include all of the reader's reports along with a letter kind of summarizing them and usually making suggestions, because if you have 2 or 3 academics, they're going to have at least 2 or 3 ideas and probably more than that. And so the editor will usually kind of cut a path through that. Like, well, I see, you know, if you take this suggestion from reviewer B and this suggestion from reviewer A, that's going to really, you know, push your article to the next level. So the process can often be hard to predict. My first article was rejected twice, and both times it went to 3 reviewers, and then the 3rd time it got accepted with no changes. So I had been working on it all along, and then it finally fell into place. On the other hand, the last article I published, I wrote really quickly, mostly because I was waiting for that report on the book, and I needed something to do, and it got accepted right away. The only suggestion was that I had to rewrite the conclusion, which was fine. So as an author, it's often hard to tell how peer review will turn out, but it's incredibly valuable. In my experience, it's always improved my work. I've always learned something that's made me a better writer. Getting that kind of objective external feedback just helps you see new things in the work that maybe you didn't even realize were important or useful to people. So it's still one of the best tools we have. And I've been trying to incorporate small versions of peer review into some of my classes so that you get comfortable with this process of having your own work reviewed. But that's how it works for us too. Anything that we get published and that therefore goes into the university library has been through this rigorous process that can take months or even years, and it's been strengthened from that experience. Thanks.
Thanks, Erin. That's great. And it was interesting that you noted about introducing that kind of process into your classes, because it is getting the students used to the idea of discussing their work or any feedback with their fellow students. And I think they miss the point that their fellow students are their peers at the moment. So it's getting to the point of understanding what is peer review process, and it can start, as you say, in the classroom. Thank you. Jennifer, do we have any questions coming through at all?
No, no questions at the moment.
Thank you. All right, so the next question, hello Bonnie. The next question will be to Bonnie, and it relates to researching, reading and thinking critically. So Bonnie, some students don't look beyond the first page of results when they're researching a topic, and they might pick papers with a particular perspective in mind. Why, in your opinion, and as an academic, why should they look further?
Look, Jenny, that's a really fantastic question, and it's I suppose what differentiates students, and it differentiates us as researchers as well. One of the biggest risks is that we are attracted to information and it feels more valid if it agrees with our own perception of the world. And that's really, really dangerous, because what we're doing is not being critical in evaluating the evidence. And I was watching a really fascinating TED talk yesterday about confirmation bias. And they were saying that almost 60% of things that are shared on Facebook or a lot of social media sites are links that are shared, but no one's actually gone to the link to look at the original source. And I think this is a version of that in the academic setting, because if you are able to drill down into the documents, how someone's paraphrased that is commonly different to how the original source approaches something. So one of the things that we often say is that go to the original source, don't quote something that quotes something else. But in a confirmation bias setting, this is also really impactful in the outcomes of your research, because if you are looking at materials that agree with the way you perceive a particular research topic, then what the danger is that you don't see the full picture. This is really something that I deal with in my sustainability teaching all the time. Sustainability deals with these sorts of problems called complex problems. And it's not just sustainability, all disciplines deal with these sorts of problems. And complex problems are a type of problem where you have different stakeholders that have very different ways of understanding a problem. And if you don't include those different perspectives, then you don't have a fuller picture of the reality of that problem. And so in sustainability, one of the things we do is we actually think about who those different stakeholders are, what the different perspectives are, and then we include that in the problem definition and the problem solution. And I think there's a mini version of that in lots of different disciplines. There are, for instance, different perspectives in hospital contexts where your medical staff have one way of understanding the reality, but the patient has a completely different perspective. And if both of those perspectives can't understand one another, then the experience of that hospital can have varying success. And so this is really relevant for research in all sorts of fields. And if you don't at least consider the broader perspective of what you're researching, then you're going to constrain what the possibilities are and the findings are. Hopefully that makes sense. Examples are always really great, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, so it comes back to making sure that you're searching widely, looking at variables, understanding that context of the research. Is there bias? What is your bias? And make sure you're questioning what you're reading and seeing.
Exactly, and the more expertise you have in a particular subject matter, the more you're able to do that, because when you're a novice entering a particular subject, you don't have the bigger context about what the field, what's the actual position that most people in that field have, what are the divergent positions that people have in that field, who are considered the experts, who are not considered the experts, what's considered valid in that discipline. So the more you are aware of those different elements within your discipline, as you build expertise, you have that context to go from. So if you're already in third year and you've had an exposure to what's happening in your field and what the current state of play is and what is considered the way the discipline sees a particular position, then you've got that perspective that you can take into your literature review, and you can understand that, okay, in my field, this is the established expertise, but there are opposing positions and it's worth considering those. So the more expertise you have in your field, the better. One example from my experience in sustainability teaching is that I had a course that I designed, and some of the readings were older. And the reason I'd included those older publications as resources for my students was because that field actually formed, that the way we think in that field formed at a particular time in the 1970s. And those formative documents were really, really quintessential in understanding the significance of sustainability science and how we think in sustainability science. And the students made a comment that some of the readings were older, and it was an opportunity for me to explain to them why some of those older publications were there, because they explained so clearly why we think like we think. And that applies, I think, to lots of different disciplines. So to have an awareness of how your disciplinary thinking has formed is really important if you're assessing the literature in that particular field. And if you don't feel like you have that expertise, then I think that's a really good prompt to go and ask those questions of the right people, so that you can be guided about where you should be looking to think more deeply and dig more deeply into the literature, rather than just looking at what's on the top of your page. One of the things that Ruth has really taught me is the implications of Googling, and how your historic searches influence what Google will provide you in the future, because there's that formula that it takes to understand what you're interested in and then applies that to the search results. And that happens in all social media. And so I think it's really dangerous for us to do research and forget that that influence is there. So social media is a classic one where you get channeled down into a bubble where everyone else agrees with everyone else. And that happens in quite a lot of other searches. It doesn't happen in the database searching that you do at the library, and that's why the library emphasises that, using those databases. But I think there's a breadth of, it depends what your subject matter is. So the Google search might be really critical for your research in certain fields. So I don't want to rule that out and say it's not a good thing. One of the things that I do is I use DuckDuckGo, which is a search engine, an alternative search engine that doesn't collect data about you as you're doing searching. So it is a little bit more helpful if I need to rely on some of those soft sort of media, social media type resources for my research.
Great, thanks for that. That's really comprehensively answered that question. Thank you. And it actually leads nicely into the question for Annika and Anna, because what I was wanting to find out from Annika and Anna is when you set an assignment, what types of sources do you expect your students to use? And, you know, is there a difference between primary and secondary sources that they're supposed to be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump in first, Anna, then with that first part of that question. So it will depend probably on your discipline and on the type of assessment itself. Generally, I'll find that it will be academic sources. And so what I mean by academic sources, a great way to simplify it maybe is to say, okay, it would be peer-reviewed sources. So you know it's verified, you know it's safe, you know it's from within an academic space almost automatically. And of course, looking at reputable journals, which you'll find through the university databases, or maybe texts that are published through academic presses. So that might be books that are published through university presses. So again, you know immediately that they are going to largely be trustworthy. And you can look through the databases, of course, through the library to find your specific discipline as well. It might depend. I've had different assessments where I've told students you need to look specifically within our discipline. And you need to look at specifically academic texts. So for instance, I'm largely coming from English, but also having taught into film, media, cultural studies, there's a bit of a difference there as well. And that will also differ as to when we're using primary or secondary texts too. So in those spaces in particular, it'll be perhaps saying we're going to be looking primarily at texts within those disciplines. It might also be saying we might, for instance, film, media, culture studies, looking slightly outside that, we might be getting interdisciplinary texts in as well. We might even be getting secondary sources such as entertainment news, rather than the more academic texts we tend to look at.
Mm. And also, Jenny, I think Ruth has got a question. Ruth, is that?
Yeah, there was a question there.
Or myself or both. It's a really good question about if you don't have time to look.
Yeah, what if students don't have enough time to look for further perspectives? Should they make time?
Yeah, look, obviously time is always a constraint, especially now when you've got so many other responsibilities as students that are on top of your study. One of the things we've talked about is the use of meta-analysis or review articles, and they can very quickly give you a very good picture of what's out there. And I'm sure, Annika, in your English area, then these things are really great as an overview. One of the things that I've started doing is actually using the conversation as a way of garnering what the accepted academic position is on something. And I'm not saying to over rely on that, because there is a lot of opinion in the conversation, but it often brings together some of those quintessential documents about what the status of a field is. And so that's kind of like a fun way of doing that, because those articles are written in a really conversational way and in an accessible way. So that might be a really fun way to do that, but certainly in a more formal sense, those reviews and in our field, the multi sort of analysis, bringing information together in the one point is really helpful as a starting point. So you can actually like include review or that search term in when you're looking at things. And again, in your field, you might have a different perspective. I'm not sure.
I actually found a article in the conversation on peer review, so I might put that link into the chat for everybody in a minute. I would like to make some points about health, perhaps, but Annika, have you finished? Just because I think
I might very briefly also quickly say to, because I know you'll probably have a different opinion or a different perspective really on this, with the idea of primary and secondary sources. So for instance, in assessment, might be setting, more likely I find in English, for instance, I'm setting a bit of a mix between primary and secondary, largely secondary, which in English in particular, so for instance, I might say we're going to analyse a primary text. So we might have a book, and that would be the primary text. It might be a contemporary novel, and then we might be going off and using secondary texts, which would be, say, analytical articles, might be potentially even things like reviews, but largely coming from that analytical perspective that is offering, might be offering a particular theory on the text. And then we might also be having, so I might have encouraging students to look at specific articles that relate to that specific text, but they might also be looking to broader issues or themes surrounding the text and its context. So I did briefly want to quickly say that, as I'm sure, Anna, you might have some different perspectives on that one as well.
Okay, thanks, Annika. I think, well, I mainly teach first and second year occupational therapy, but I have a little bit of a perspective of what some of the other lecturers teach in later years as well, or some of the assignments that students have to tackle. And yeah, I mainly come from occupational therapy's perspective, but I guess I am here representing health more broadly in a way. In terms of the primary sort of sources, I remember when in preparation for this, we had a bit of a chat, and I think Bonnie mentioned was mainly sort of your data was sort of your primary source. And I do think that potentially for us as occupational therapists or in health, for students that might have an assignment around like a viva post-placement where they need to present a case, for us a primary source and data might be what you've been able to collect on placement potentially. So some assessments conducted or some interviews. So I think that's an example of how students can integrate a primary source. But another, and I don't know if you all agree, but a primary research article I would still see as a primary source, even though it does have that little bit of analysis, which typically you differentiate between primary and secondary, with secondary incorporating some sort of synthesis or analysis there. So in assignments for our students, because they do need to be deciding on interventions that they might be using for a particular case, they might use, you know, a randomized controlled trial, so a primary sort of primary research article, so original research conducted by the authors and reported by the authors. So they might use that, but you also might bring a secondary source in, which I would sort of typically see as something like a systematic review or a literature review, systematic review potentially with meta-analyses where there's that higher level of synthesis. So they're synthesizing other primary research that's been conducted. So that's just some examples for students of how you can integrate that type of information into assignments. And I think also just picking up on some of the other themes that people have touched on, I'd encourage students to come back to the assignment criteria again. So for some of our fourth years, they're doing program design, where you might want to integrate, you know, interventions. So you're going to need to research interventions to plan your program and to maybe put them together in a new way and decide how long your program is going to be delivered for, so a health program. And yes, so you might draw on, look quite broadly, get a systematic review first. That's going to help direct you towards some more specific sort of studies, so some primary sources like a randomized controlled trial, potentially. But you also might want to look at some websites, because you need to look at what programs exist out there already. Now, you might get that from a systematic review, maybe, or a literature review, but I think you really need to be looking at websites, so government websites, maybe even, you know, private practices that are out there that might offer specific programs. So I would encourage students to not discount websites, and Bonnie did say that, not to discount social media or websites, but just to think critically and head in thinking that there might be some bias there that they need to critique. But it depends on the point that you are trying to make in your assignment. I'd encourage students to look at that very, very carefully, because for some points, I don't want to see a randomized control trial or a systematic review. And that's what I'm looking at when I'm marking. Okay. And just, sorry, one other example, and Jennifer Go helped me with this with my first years. So we had a little task for them that we set that where they needed to investigate, say, the role of occupational therapy in aged care. And what we did was pull up some YouTube videos to sort of get the students to look at this. And one of the ones we got was something like aged care provided by Anglicare. So it was a YouTube video, and we analysed that, and we used the TRAP criteria, so a specific acronym to help with that. So that's looking at timeliness, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. I was going to see if I could pull up the diagram, but I couldn't get it out of our Blackboard module, so maybe we could provide that in a different way. But we got the students to work through that and look at this YouTube video and you know, highlight the bias that, of course, this particular company is trying to show a very positive picture of life in this aged care facility. And maybe you do want to get a broad picture of what happens in aged care facilities, but is it the best video to see what an occupational therapist does in that setting? No, I don't think so. But look for what you can get from that source. So we could see pictures of assistive devices or environmental modifications or clients engaging in meaningful occupation. So you could start to see, oh, maybe occupational therapists can help in, you know, in those areas. And that was a little clue that sent them off to go and look at, maybe look in OT Seeker for systematic reviews of environmental modifications, for example. So yes, that acronym helped, but it was also just looking at the video and working as a group, trying to nut out what were we really seeing in that video. And if you're concerned about maybe quality of aged care, then maybe you're looking off in government sort of documents or looking at healthcare policy around quality and safety and, you know, royal commissions and things like that. So it just depends on the information that you require for your assignment. So I think that's all. There's some evidence-based practice information I could go into, but I think, you know, so I would just make a couple of points about hierarchies of evidence. So this starts to come into second year for us, where you're looking at doing critical appraisal of the research articles that you find. So there's different levels of evidence, and the level of evidence you require depends on the question that you're asking. And there's specific checklists that can help there. So something like CASP checklist, the Critical Appraisal Skills Program checklist, that helps students to work through and critically appraise an article. And it is important that we go through those processes because it's all about providing safe and effective and efficient care, so cost-effective care as well. So there's different factors that our students need to start to consider because ultimately we're preparing them to be clinicians out there making great decisions. So a lot of our assignments are case-based, where you're really starting to think like a clinician, and we have to prepare them to be evidence-based practitioners. So sorry, there's some things to help.
Yeah. Look, I really like your emphasis there, Anna, on answering what the question is asking. I think in science, as an example, that there are strengths and limitations to what the evidence says, and it really depends on what you're asking of the evidence. And one of the classical things that we come across in our science field, and it may be relevant to other people's field as well, is that we look at average responses and the averages from data, and that's interpreting that primary data source. But sometimes in science, we're much more interested in the variability of the data rather than the average. And so I'm presuming, Anna, in your field, as an example, that you're dealing with individuals. So yeah, an average response is something that's really interesting and important to know. but the variability around that average is also just
Yes. Yeah.
So if you're, I mean, we're getting quite nuanced in how we're dealing with the questions, but I think this is what what we should be talking about at this stage, because if you're really wanting to, and climate change is the same for our field, for instance, there are average responses that the modelling predicts, but there could be massive variability around that average, and that's just as important to talk about. So I think it's really important for us to understand detail underneath that. In science, the other thing is that we often talk about correlation and not causation. And so being able to use that lens when we're looking at the data is really important. Even in a lot of the peer-reviewed publications, people are talking about correlations between things as if they may imply causation. And so we have to be really careful in how we interpret our data, the primary sources.
Yeah, I think we were sort of going to maybe touch on that in the second part that we were going to run the beginning of next semester. But as you say, it's a really important factor for students to incorporate into their thinking, and it's all to do with doing that critical thinking, reading critically, and I think one of you coined it once before, being a bit skeptical about what you're looking at and making sure you question what is it that I'm looking at. But Anna and Annika, you gave some great examples there, because we do find that students find it hard to understand the difference between what is a primary source and what is a secondary source. And depending on which discipline you're in, a primary source in humanities is going to be different to a primary source in health or science, and the same with secondary sources as well.
Can I offer my shorthand definition that I use in interdisciplinary teaching?
Sure.
I always tell them that the primary source is the thing you're analyzing, and the secondary sources are other people analyzing that thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So, because I mean, there are lots of nuances, and that is a very reductive definition. But if you can just remember, you know, if it's a poem, that's primary source. If it's a book about a poem, that's a secondary source.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Now we'll cycle back to the questions. Were there any questions, Jennifer, that needed to be asked at this stage?
No questions. There are some links, but we can post that when we break up the videos into different sections.
All right. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of the webinar time that we had booked. Thank you so much, Erin, Anna, Annika and Bonnie. It's been wonderful to hear these perspectives from the different areas and the different disciplines, because, as I said, these cause concern and confusion for our students. So to have these explanations from you as the lecturers, the academics, for the students is going to be really helpful. Next time we're going to be talking in more depth about critically evaluating the evidence and the different ways you can be doing that critical analysis. So that'll be possibly in August sometime. But thank you again. Thank you for giving your time up today to come and do this. It's been great.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah.